why ancient Greeks had better memories than us. Your brain is getting weaker every single day, and you don't even realize it's happening. But 2,500 years ago, people could memorize entire books without even trying. Here's the shocking truth about what we lost, and why the ancient Greeks could remember more in a day than you can in a month. Back in ancient Greece, there was no such thing as writing things down to remember them later. Well, writing existed, but it was expensive and rare. Most people didn't have access to it. So if you wanted to remember something, you actually had to remember it. There was no other option. And the crazy thing is, they were really good at it, like insanely good. Greek students would memorize entire epic poems. We're talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey here. The Iliad alone has over 15,000 lines of poetry. That's roughly 200 pages of text, and kids were expected to recite huge chunks of it from memory. Now, before you think, well, they were just smarter back then, let me stop you right there. Their brains weren't any different from ours. Same hardware, same basic structure, but they were using their brains in a completely different way. And scientists have recently figured out exactly what they were doing, that we've completely forgotten how to do. Let me introduce you to a guy named Simonides of Chios. He lived around 500 BC, and he's the person who supposedly invented the entire system of memory techniques that the Greeks used. And the way he discovered it is one of the most disturbing stories in ancient history. Simonides was a poet, and one night he was hired to perform at a big fancy banquet. Rich people, important political figures, all sitting around eating and drinking while Simonides recited poetry for them. Pretty standard gig. But during the banquet, Simonides was called outside by two men who wanted to speak with him. So he stepped out of the banquet hall. And while he was outside, the entire roof of the building collapsed. Everyone inside was killed, crushed instantly. And the bodies were so mangled that nobody could identify who was who. Families couldn't recognize their own relatives. It was a complete disaster. But here's where it gets interesting. Simonides realized something. Even though he couldn't recognize the faces of the dead, he could remember exactly where each person had been sitting. He closed his eyes and walked through the banquet hall in his mind. He could see the room perfectly, and more importantly, he could see every single person in their exact seat. He used this mental image to identify all the bodies. He'd point to a crushed body and say, "That's the person who was sitting in the third seat on the left side of the table." And he was right, every single time. This experience made Simonides realize something profound about how memory works. Our brains are incredibly good at remembering places and locations. We evolved to remember where things are because that's what kept our ancestors alive. Remember where the water source is. Remember where the dangerous animals live. Remember how to get back home. So Simonides developed a technique based on this. It's called the method of loci, or the memory palace technique, and it's the foundation of almost every memory system used in ancient Greece and Rome. Here's how it works. You imagine a place you know really well. Could be your house, could be a route you walk every day, could be any location that's familiar to you. Then you take the information you want to remember, and you place it in different locations throughout that space. Let's say you need to memorize a shopping list. Milk, eggs, bread, cheese, apples. Instead of just repeating those words over and over, you'd imagine walking through your house and seeing these items in specific locations. You open your front door, and there's a giant carton of milk blocking the entrance. You step over it and see eggs splattered all over your living room floor. You walk to your kitchen, and there's bread stacked up to the ceiling. You get the idea. This sounds weird, right? Why would imagining ridiculous scenes help you remember better than just repeating the words? Because your brain doesn't work with words naturally. Language is actually a pretty recent invention in evolutionary terms. We've only had complex language for maybe 100,000 years, but we've had spatial awareness and visual memory for millions of years. Your brain has massive amounts of processing power dedicated to remembering locations and visual information, way more than it has for remembering abstract words or concepts. So when you convert information into a visual journey through a physical space, you're tapping into the most powerful memory system your brain has. The ancient Greeks understood this instinctively. They didn't have neuroscience or brain scans, but they figured out through experience that this technique worked incredibly well, and they used it for everything. But here's the thing. They didn't just use this technique for memorization. The act of creating these mental spaces and filling them with information actually changed how they thought. See, when you memorize something using a memory palace, you're not just storing facts, you're creating relationships between ideas. You're organizing information spatially. You're making connections that wouldn't exist if you just read the information off a page. This is why ancient Greek philosophers were so good at complex reasoning and argumentation. They weren't just remembering facts, they were building elaborate mental structures where different ideas connected to each other in meaningful ways. A Greek student studying philosophy wouldn't just memorize what Socrates said. They'd create a mental space where Socrates' ideas lived, and they could walk through that space, examining the ideas from different angles, seeing how they connected to each other. This is completely different from how we learn today. We read something, maybe highlight it, maybe write notes, but we're not building these rich mental structures. We're just trying to shove information into our heads and hope it stays there. Now you might be thinking, okay, but we have writing now. We have computers. We can just look things up. Why do we need to memorize anything? And that's exactly the problem. That's exactly what's making our memories weaker. There's actually a term for this. It's called cognitive offloading. Basically, whenever we have an external tool that can store information for us, our brains decide they don't need to remember that information anymore. You don't remember phone numbers because your phone remembers them for you. You don't remember directions because GPS tells you where to go. You don't remember facts because you can just Google them. And every time you offload a memory task to an external tool, you're making your memory slightly weaker. Not because there's anything wrong with your brain, but because your brain is smart. It doesn't waste energy on things it doesn't need to do. This is actually a problem that dates back way further than smartphones. The ancient Greeks themselves worried about this. There's a famous dialogue written by Plato, where Socrates tells a story about the invention of writing. In the story, the god Thoth invents writing and presents it to the king of Egypt as a gift. Thoth says writing will make people wiser and improve their memories. But the king disagrees. He says writing will actually make people's memories worse because they'll rely on written words instead of remembering things themselves. They'll have the appearance of wisdom without the reality of it. And Socrates agreed with the king. He thought writing was dangerous because it would make people intellectually lazy. Now obviously writing turned out to be pretty useful. We wouldn't have civilization without it. But Socrates had a point. When you write something down, you don't engage with it the same way as when you memorize it. Think about it. When you memorize something, really memorize it, you have to process it deeply. You have to understand it. You have to connect it to things you already know. The act of memorization forces you to think. But when you just write something down or save it to your phone, you're not processing it, you're just storing it. And there's a huge difference. Modern neuroscience has confirmed this. Studies show that when students take notes by hand, they remember the material better than students who type notes on a laptop. Not because there's anything magical about pen and paper, but because handwriting is slower. The slowness forces you to process the information and decide what's important enough to write down. When you type, you can transcribe almost everything the teacher says without thinking about it. You're just recording, not learning. The ancient Greeks didn't have this problem because they couldn't offload their memory to external tools. If they wanted to remember something, they had to actually remember it. And this constant exercise kept their memory systems incredibly strong. But they also had another huge advantage that we've completely lost. They lived in an oral culture. In ancient Greece, most information was transmitted through speech, not writing. If you wanted to learn philosophy, you'd sit and listen to a philosopher speak. If you wanted to learn history, you'd listen to stories. If you wanted to learn poetry, you'd hear it recited. And this oral culture developed specific techniques to make information easier to remember. Epic poems like the Iliad weren't just written in verse because it sounded pretty. They were written in a specific rhythmic pattern with lots of repetition and formulaic phrases because that made them easier to memorize and recite. You know how songs get stuck in your head way easier than random facts? Same principle. The ancient Greeks structured information in ways that fit naturally into how our brains want to remember things. They used rhythm, rhyme, repetition, and vivid imagery. They told stories instead of listing facts. They made information emotional and engaging instead of dry and abstract. And here's something fascinating. Research on oral cultures that still exist today shows that people in these cultures have memory abilities that seem almost superhuman to us. There are cultures in Africa and Australia where elders can recite their entire tribal history, going back dozens of generations. They can remember complex genealogies, historical events, geographic information, all without writing any of it down. When researchers test these people, they find that their memory capacity isn't any different from ours biologically, but their memory performance is vastly superior because they've been training their memory their entire lives. It's the same reason Olympic athletes can do things with their bodies that seem impossible to regular people, not because they have different bodies, but because they've trained intensively. Your memory is like a muscle. Use it, and it gets stronger. Stop using it, and it atrophies. And we've stopped using our memories. We've outsourced them to our phones, our computers, our notebooks. And in the process, we've lost abilities that used to be completely normal. But here's the good news. Those abilities aren't gone. They're just dormant, and you can wake them up. There's a whole community of people today who practice ancient memory techniques. They compete in memory competitions where they memorize hundreds of random numbers, dozens of shuffled decks of cards, pages of random words, all in a matter of minutes. And these aren't people with special brains or genetic advantages. They're just regular people who learned the same techniques the ancient Greeks used. One of the most famous memory competitors is a guy named Joshua Foer. He was a journalist who started covering memory championships and got curious about whether he could do it himself. He spent a year training with ancient memory techniques, and by the end of that year, he won the USA Memory Championship. He wrote a book about his experience, and one of the main points he makes is that anyone can do this. The techniques work. They've always worked. We've just forgotten how to use them. But here's what's really interesting. The people who practice these techniques don't just get better at memorizing random information. They report that their thinking becomes clearer. They can hold more complex ideas in their head at once. They can see connections between concepts more easily. Because memory isn't separate from thinking. Memory is the foundation of thinking. Every thought you have is built from memories. When you solve a problem, you're pulling up relevant memories and combining them in new ways. When you have an insight, you're connecting memories that weren't previously linked. When you imagine something, you're recombining elements from your memories into new configurations. If your memory is weak, your thinking is weak. It's that simple. The ancient Greeks understood this. That's why they put so much emphasis on memory training. They knew that a strong memory wasn't just useful for remembering facts. It was essential for wisdom, for intelligence, for the ability to think deeply about complex topics. Modern education has completely lost sight of this. We act like memorization is the enemy of understanding. We say things like, I don't need to memorize it, I can just look it up. But that's backwards. You can't understand something deeply if you don't have it in your memory. You can't think about ideas if you have to constantly look them up. Real understanding requires you to hold information in your mind, to turn it over, to see it from different angles, to connect it to other things you know. And you can't do any of that if the information only exists on a screen somewhere. There's actually research showing that students who are allowed to use the internet during exams perform worse than students who have to rely on their memory, even on open book exams. Because the act of looking something up interrupts your thinking. It breaks your concentration. It prevents you from holding enough information in your mind to see the bigger picture. So what happened? Why did we go from a culture that valued memory and trained it intensively to a culture that sees memory as almost irrelevant? The printing press is probably the biggest factor. When books became cheap and widely available, the need to memorize information decreased dramatically. Why memorize a poem when you can just read it in a book whenever you want? Then came computers and the internet, which accelerated this trend exponentially. Now we have access to essentially all human knowledge in our pockets. The practical need for memorization seems to have disappeared entirely, but we're starting to realize what we've lost. Cognitive scientists are finding that our constant use of external memory tools is having real effects on how our brains work. Studies show that people who rely heavily on GPS have worse spatial awareness and navigation skills. People who rely on spell check have worse spelling. When you let these skills atrophy, you're not just losing the ability to do a specific task. You're weakening the underlying cognitive systems that support many different types of thinking. And memory is the most fundamental cognitive system of all. When you stop exercising your memory, you're weakening the foundation that all your other cognitive abilities are built on. So what can you do about this? How can you rebuild the memory abilities that humans used to have naturally? First, understand that you're fighting against the way modern life is designed. Everything in our world is set up to make memory unnecessary. You have to actively choose to exercise your memory, because nothing will force you to do it. Second, start small. Don't try to memorize the entire Iliad on day one. Begin with something simple, a shopping list, a short poem, a speech you need to give, and use the techniques the ancient Greeks used. Don't just repeat things over and over. That's the weakest form of memorization. Instead, create vivid visual images. Place those images in locations. Tell yourself a story. The more bizarre and ridiculous you make the images, the better they'll stick. Your brain is designed to remember unusual things because unusual things might be important or dangerous. So if you're trying to remember that you need to buy eggs, don't just imagine a normal egg. Imagine a 10-foot-tall egg wearing a top hat and dancing. It sounds stupid, but it works. The ancient Greeks knew this. That's why their memory palaces were filled with weird, exaggerated, often violent or sexual imagery. They weren't being weird for the sake of it. They were exploiting how memory actually works. Third, practice regularly. Like any skill, memory gets better with consistent practice. Set aside time each day to memorize something, anything. A poem, a list of historical dates, the names of everyone in your office building. The specific content doesn't matter as much as the practice itself. You're training your brain to be good at remembering, and that's a general skill that will help you in all areas of life. Fourth, reduce your reliance on external memory tools. This doesn't mean throwing away your phone, but it does mean being intentional about when you use these tools. Try to remember phone numbers instead of immediately saving them. Try to navigate without GPS sometimes. Try to remember your schedule instead of checking your calendar every 5 minutes. Every time you successfully remember something instead of looking it up, you're making your memory slightly stronger. And finally, understand that this isn't just about memory. The ancient Greeks knew that a well-trained memory was the foundation of wisdom. They spent years developing their memory skills because they understood that memory wasn't separate from intelligence. It was the basis of intelligence. We've forgotten that lesson. We've decided that memory is obsolete, that we can just Google whatever we need to know. But we're wrong. Memory matters, not just for remembering facts, but for thinking clearly, for understanding deeply, for seeing connections that others miss. The good news is that you can get these abilities back. The techniques still work. Your brain still has all the same capabilities it's always had. You just have to use them. So the next time you reach for your phone to look something up, pause. Try to remember it instead. Use the techniques the ancient Greeks used. Build a memory palace. Create vivid images. Make connections. It'll feel hard at first because your memory is out of practice. But stick with it. Give it time. And gradually, you'll notice something. Not just that you're remembering more, but that you're thinking more clearly. Ideas will come to you more easily. You'll see patterns and connections that you missed before, because that's what a strong memory does. It doesn't just store information, it makes you smarter. The ancient Greeks understood this 2,500 years ago.